Social identity theorists have come up with two hypotheses for why individuals choose to become members of a group or otherwise identify as a sense of self-belonging with a group. The first is the self-esteem hypothesis, and the second is the uncertainty reduction hypothesis. While the self-esteem hypothesis is especially helpful to explain the various positive social movements we've seen dating back to the civil rights movement, in which individuals and groups organized and collectively demonstrated to show their skills, abilities, and capacities to contribute to culture and society more broadly, the uncertainty reduction hypothesis more helpfully allows us to explain why some individuals might join into conspiracy groups or even hate groups and racist organizations, which might allow them to see themselves as superior or the others as inferior in a way that provides them a sense of cognitive capacity or otherwise provides them a sense of ability that they wouldn't otherwise view in such an uncertain world. In this sense, social identity theories are useful for both explaining positive social movements and empowerment and the various changes we've seen in liberation dating back from the 1960s and onward, but also helpful to explain the dark side of communication in which groups and individuals often organize in ways that are polarizing and intolerant of others. We previously talked about the mode model of motivation. The mode model of motivation suggested that individuals could be motivated based on their individual reasoning or even based on those peripheral shortcuts of reasoning that they might have been taught by narratives in society or by those shortcuts and brief heuristic clues that they've learned throughout time. However, social identity theorists challenge the mode model and say that it's not always about individual reasoning or even individual belief systems. Indeed, they note that sometimes in a crowd, individual belief systems are suspended or shut down while a crowd mentality emerges, and certain behaviors, like throwing a bottle or rioting against the police, are suddenly acceptable in ways where if you had used individual reasoning or even thought through those shortcuts of rationality, you perhaps wouldn't have made the same decisions. In this sense, the side model is the social identity model of de-individuation, which suggests that we're not always individuated by things like advertising and marketing, but we're sometimes cast into groups. And the effect of being cast into groups has various different appeals, which we as persuaders might be able to capitalize on in ways that can lead to better ethical or effective communication. The first thing the side model of communication notes is that individuals often in a crowd find themselves not as representatives of that crowd, but rather as members of that crowd. And this idea of membership versus representation enables a certain subset of behavioral change. You feel as if no one's looking at you and if everyone else is doing it, then certainly it's acceptable too, and this creates certain behavioral exceptions that might not otherwise be ethical or effective. The second thing to note is this idea of the crowd mentality which might emerge in such large situations. Perhaps you're familiar with fanaticism, or you've seen the types of riotous behaviors of crowds shown in videos before. Certainly, this is the risk of a crowd mentality. And so this brings up our third point, which is the importance of leadership and ethical influencers during turbulent times. I think we can certainly think through our own personal examples of where that ethical leadership is important, and if perhaps those are less clear, we might think through something like the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster and the way that groupthink, or otherwise individuals who are afraid to challenge authority and just simply said yes, and that classic system of the yes men ends up leading to a certain groupthink mentality or crowd mentality which challenges rationality or reasoning and doesn't allow us to think carefully or critically in ways that we might otherwise need to. So we should avoid groupthink, we should think carefully about our role within crowds, and we should challenge or otherwise seek to improve the leadership or ethical influencing during these situations. So as we revisit framing, we've previously talked about framing as if the speaker could just adjust a single word. Perhaps by calling it enhanced interrogation instead of torture, we might shift our audience's understanding of the message in some unique and important way. However, as we think through the social identity model or the side model of de-individuation, we should note that it's not always these simple word changes, but instead the social and collective structures of consciousness that otherwise guide our framing. And in this sense, there are two important assumptions we should revisit. The first is that humans are cognitive misers. And when we say that humans are cognitive misers, it means that their effort is to try to resolve the world as if it's a puzzle, but in the most simple and elegant way, rather than in the most complex and mathematical way. And this often leads to particular shortcuts that can lead us astray or deceive us. And so, simply acting or appearing rational doesn't mean something is valid or is even reputable. And so instead, we should think about the way that preferences and motivations or understandings of identity and behavior are formed through collective societal processes that often come from narratives and come from years of experience that are accrued over time. In this regard, we might return to framing theories and ask a couple of key questions. The first might be, how come people self-define as members of some groups and not other groups? And the second might be, to what extent does their choice to identify in this particular group influence or predict their behavior to do a particular action? In other words, if somebody is already enrolled to vote as a particular party's candidate, you've already signed up for the blue team or already signed up for the red team in the primaries, how much more likely are you to actually vote on that final Tuesday election day? This might be a question for future social identity theorists and the work that they're conducting now. As you're thinking about how you might apply social identity theories in the analysis of your upcoming fact campaign paper, you might think about the role that influencers have in otherwise mobilizing the identities of the groups that they seek to tailor or address themselves towards. One of the more interesting passages in our second reading is about identity entrepreneurship, and I thought that you might find that section to be a fruitful passage to include in your own campaign analyses paper. They note that identity entrepreneurship is a powerful framing technique that targets the self-understanding of a group and otherwise uses that definition of us as a group to pave new ways or definitions of behavior that allow the group to understand itself. I think in the context of our social media moment, we're often surrounded by folks like life coaches and influencers who certainly use identity mobilization to target and appeal their strategic discourses toward a certain audiences in ways that ask those audiences to define themselves as members of a particular group, whether that's something like a particular essential oil company, an athletic wear company, or even a value or belief like wildlife endangerment and the rescue for animals that are otherwise in cages. All of those would provide different forms of identity entrepreneurship. I think we often think of the role of the influencer as somebody who's capitalizing on the latest trend. But our reading asks us to pause and think a little bit differently about the role of the influencer, and instead notes that rather than simply capitalizing on the trend or following what's already happening, the influencer is adept at surfing that existing wave, carving that wave, and using the wave to perform in ways that actually launch it or find new ways to create identity-based master frames. And so the role of an influencer isn't just to find what's already cool, but it's to shape what's cool and otherwise lead to the conversations that others are having about that very product, social idea, health campaign, or otherwise political opinion that they're involved in. So influencers are really good at creating strong frames, and scholars of communication are interested in what builds a strong frame. One of the first and foremost answers we have to what builds a strong frame is a frame that mobilizes identities or moves people, in other words, persuades people. Scholars have found that there are three key characteristics of frames that mobilize identity. The first is that they tend to evoke an us versus them characterization. Now note, this us versus them characterization should be conducted ethically and effectively. Perhaps here you can recall the Twix campaign that asks you to choose which side you're on. Secondly, one of the most important characteristics of an identity mobilizing frame is that it should portray the issue as one that is either for or against our values in some way that helps us, the group, define how we might believe in ourselves or sense our sense of self and categorization. And third and finally, it should portray those who oppose the group as otherwise being hostile to the in-group and exhibiting values that aren't otherwise encouraged by those in the in-group membership. So I want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about social marketing campaigns and where we might see social identity theory. I've already described where we might see social identity theory in the context of actual marketing, noting the Twix campaign. Perhaps you can think about social identity theory in a campaign that sells not just a product, but also markets itself towards an idea. In our upcoming lecture, we'll be spending a whole lot more time talking about social marketing and the concepts associated with it. Additionally, you might think about the way that health campaigns often use social identity theory to target various different identities or otherwise encourage various different audience demographics to consider coming in for a checkup, to get the health care that they need, or otherwise be in conversation with their friends and family about the important public health issues that they're focused on. Finally, you might think about the way that this social identity theory applies to political campaigns or otherwise helps politicians make implicit values appeals that distinguish their campaign, their political perspective from their oppositional parties or those they seek to distinguish themselves. Perhaps social identity theory is most obvious in the political realm, in which the increasing hyperpolarization of the red versus blue politics that we see today can so easily be described by the theory's concepts, principles, and some of the guidelines it describes. Finally, if we were in class together today, I would ask you to briefly brainstorm on social identity theory and its main concepts and components. Working in small groups, I'd ask you to think about the way that UNLV students themselves are an in-group and the way that they might have out-groups. You might think through the related associations that UNLV has with other college campuses and other college students. And you might even seek to distinguish whether or not UNLV has any influencers of its own. If given the opportune time, I would ask you to brainstorm a marketing campaign that could be used to advocate for some sort of social marketing change on our campus, and I would ask you to think the way you might generate a dominant frame that mobilizes identity around this issue. Since we don't necessarily have time for it in an in-class discussion with our online transition, perhaps that's something we can do through GChat, Google Hangouts, or even in an upcoming exam question at the end of our semester. In our next video lecture, we'll be discussing social marketing and the social and psychological foundations of marketing. Don't forget, writing journal number 6 is due this Tuesday, and so if you haven't already turned that in, it was extended from the Thursday to provide you an additional weekend during this turbulent transition time. This concludes our presentation, but of course I'm available at any time. You can reach out to me on the Google Hangouts or GChat line. That link is available at our Canvas course site. If you send me a message between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., I'll do my best to reply within about 2 hours. If not, I'll get to you the next available day. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you with our next video lecture about social marketing on Thursday.